Hi, welcome back to Uncommon Sense. We are fresh from our August break and coming to you as ever, stretched across time zones and hemispheres. I'm Rosie Hancock in Sydney.
And I'm Alexis Hutrong in Gatineau City, Quebec. And we're talking about reproduction today. Not the kind you learn about in school, a different kind.
Yeah, we're talking about love and emotions. But we're not getting biological about relationships and reproduction. Instead, we're going to be talking about the work of creating good feeling, good vibes, you might say, love, in fact, and how that kind of work, that kind of labour is done, let's face it, by certain people more than others, and goes towards serving or, in fact, reproducing, you guessed it, capitalism. Or perhaps even, and I'm going to say the magic word, neoliberalism.
Indeed. And this podcast comes to you from the Sociological Review Foundation, and it's all about taking everyday ideas and notions and flipping them sideways to give them kind of like the sociological treatment, not for the sake of it, not to be clever or sadistic or anything, right? But because we think that the sociological imagination can really help to see the world and our place in it a little differently, more clearly, more critically.
Today's guest is Alva Gotby, a writer and organiser whose book, They Call It Love, offers up a theory of emotional reproduction. And if you don't know what that is right now, you are about to find out that you're probably doing it all the time anyway. She joins us now from London. Hi, Alva.
Hi.
Alva, there is a heavy theoretical line we could go down today, which we're going to try and avoid and kind of bust through the theory via some examples and questions about how we live now. So there's this term that the sociologists listening will be used to hearing, social reproduction. A very quick and dirty kind of way of thinking about social reproduction is that it's the often unseen and often material things that go on to keep our capitalistic society ticking over to maintaining the status quo. So it could be enrolling your kid in school, but it's also having a kid in the first place because you're maintaining and reproducing kind of particular norms around family life and creating these new and diligent workers. So what I'd like to know is, how is emotional reproduction a distinct part of this? Can you perhaps give us an example or two from your own life or from today even?
Yeah, I mean, emotional reproduction is part of social reproduction more broadly. But it's a part that I think is especially difficult to talk about because it is often so invisible, taken for granted, and it's just sort of done out of love. So when I talk about emotional reproduction, I mean all of the things that we do for other people in order to meet other people's emotional needs, make sure that people feel sort of well enough to keep going to work and, sustaining society in that way. And that can be cheering up a child or a loved one. And it's often those things that aren't really noticed even because we sort of just assume that that's what we do. Examples from my own life, it can just be like chatting to a colleague who's having a bad day, or I do a lot of work sort of supporting people who are going through difficult situations with the housing, for example, and that can also be part of emotional reproduction because it's sort of helping people cope with our lives that we know under capitalism, and especially under neoliberal capitalism, like very stressful. Lots of people are going through like really difficult situations.
Mm-hmm. And like this emotional reproduction is not a synonym, like it's different from, let's say, emotional labor. That's a term that's traveled way beyond sociology. Like I read a great piece by Sean Fay about how it's been used to complain about pretty much any hint of feeling of being put upon in a relationship, like having to help out a sibling and like things like that. But as that piece also notes, the term came from Arlie Hochschild in the early 80s to refer to people having to manage and perform, basically commodify certain emotions as part of their job, right? And you often hear the example of air stewards having to smile all the time, or maybe like people like nurses and doctors and so on, like doing these kinds of emotional work. But emotional reproduction is different. So to kind of get this straight and to define emotional reproduction a bit more, we're going to do a quick fire quiz and ask you to label a few scenarios for us. So here goes. Making a packed lunch for my son or a coffee for my partner.
I mean, this is sort of classic social reproduction, right? The primary need that you're meeting is someone's need for eating or getting that caffeine hit. But I think there's also something around emotional reproduction here in terms of you sort of communicating something that goes beyond just wanting to have your partner like drink their coffee. It's also a sort of gesture of caring for them as people.
Okay, being smiled at by the Amazon delivery guy.
This is very much emotional labor as Ali Hochschild defined it. This is the like kind of service economy type job where you have to be polite to customers. And I would say it's different from emotional reproduction because most people don't really rely on their Amazon driver to sort of meet their emotional needs, right? Or the barista at Starbucks. You might be upset if they're like really rude to you, but it's probably not the people you go to sort of, get that emotional care that you need.
What about when I have like a 5-minute conversation with my elderly neighbour when I go to take her bins out for her?
I think that could be an example of emotional reproduction. It's more sort of in someone's community, more part of an ongoing relationship that you might have with your neighbour. And especially if that neighbour is, like a single older person who might not even have that many other connections in their life. And that conversation is actually really important for them. I would say that's part of emotional reproduction.
Or, a mum being her family's point of contact in the WhatsApp group for local parents and, always being the person who replies to birthday party invitations.
Yeah, I mean, that's another example that I talk a little bit about in the book. Emotional reproduction is not just a sort of individual like acts of maybe telling someone that you love them or, listening when they're upset. It's also about sustaining those relationships in the first place. Sort of sending birthday cards and making sure that families stay in touch. That could be an example of emotional reproduction.
Okay. Thank you. I think that's helped hopefully straighten things out. So the obvious uncommon sense thing here for us is that it's pretty clear we'd be wrong to think of the home and the realm of feeling as separate from capitalism. And I think that you argue that everything's entangled, right? And sort of alongside that, I wonder if we're better at recognising labour directed towards material ends rather than emotional ones.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in terms of the question about what we see as private really being entangled with, capitalist economies, I think is really important because it helps us think about how this is not just about sort of individual relationships, although it is about that as well, but it sort of goes beyond that. And the fact that people have particular emotional needs and sort of need some emotional stability in order to keep sort of functioning in society, keep going to work every day. That's a really important aspect for me about emotional reproduction. And these are things that are often thought of as like the most intimate relationships that we do have, but they're also really important for how societies are sustained, how people come to have certain sort of emotional investments or attachments to particular kinds of lives. That's not just a sort of individual thing, but it relates to society as a whole. And in terms of the emotional side being really invisible as labour, we have this sort of idea that these relationships are like really private and they're not really sort of contaminated with like capitalist ideas of work. And we absolutely don't want to think of them in that way.
Yeah, this really connects like very private experiences to really sociological questions. And all of this so far kind of makes me think about Bev Skegg's work, her landmark book, Formations of Class and Gender, on working class women, subjectivity, and the idea of respectability. It also makes me think of a very different work by Betty Friedan The Feminine Mystique, which held a mirror up to American housewives, showing them their own dissatisfaction back in the 60s. I mean, it would seem emotional reproduction has, for a long time, perhaps forever actually, been highly gendered and highly classed. Yeah, but it isn't only done by women in heterosexual relationships, of course, or women with kids, or is it? Even if that's where it's been heavily normalized, what will you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to say that this type of work is often done by women, and often women of a particular position, and that's why Skeggs's work is so important as well, because she's really thinking about the sort of the subjectivity that's created here, and how people come to really sort of identify with the type of work that they're doing, with some tension, of course, and that I think where is a lot of this feminist theory is coming from, right? Is that women have been doing this work, but and sort of identifying with it in some senses, but also not. There's some tension. There's some people, feeling frustrations with these roles. So that I think is an important starting point. But then that doesn't mean that it's sort of only within the nuclear heterosexual family that it happens. So if we look at Hochschild's work, again, for example, she's thinking about how the research that she was doing in the 70s was often about how women were sort of taking the skills that they had been trained for since childhood often, and were sort of in a way meant to apply within the sphere of the nuclear family, and then applying them to the world of work instead, and in a growing service economy. And yeah, it's not just women who are doing this work, but I think it's important to think about it in terms of what kinds of hierarchies are created. And I think in terms of what we sometimes talk about as sort of feminized types of work, that's often work that is done in order to meet someone else's needs, often their emotional needs as well. And it's also sort of creating a hierarchy, whether that's like a gender hierarchy or a class hierarchy, where the person who's meeting other people's needs is sort of placed lower down in a social hierarchy.
Oh, well, wherever it happens, it seems like emotional reproduction doesn't just mitigate the impact of capitalism or work, the warm bath or the hug, whatever, but it also kind of creates the good feeling that helps people want to go off to work or, go to school and then go to work in the first place. And you write of emotional reproduction securing attachments to social hierarchy and the status quo. What does that mean? And how early does that start?
Yeah, I think we can think of emotional reproduction as sort of compensating for all the hardship that people go through. But this part about attachment is really important, because it's sort of giving people the sense that even if you maybe not, having such a great life right now, you're still hoping that things can get better in the future if you sort of just behave in the right way, if you get the right job, if you meet that right person that you can marry and have kids with. And so this idea that you sort of that you could have the life that you want. And I think a lot of emotional reproduction is it's meeting people's basic needs, but it's sort of going beyond that as well, in terms of creating these investments really in particular kinds of life. People, come to aspire to having a good career, having a partner and kids, maybe buying a house. And that is sort of seen as I guess in Sarah Ahmed's terms, the sort of the promise of happiness that we sort of all meant to aspire to.
So your book is called They Call It Love. Could you say more about this? I guess, people like to think love is above deconstruction or cynicism or something like that, right? Maybe we're all romantics or something. And I guess I've been trying to disentangle this, and I wondered if you could help me. When I think of love, and, when I think of like Hugh Grant style Love Actually, I love you, kind of love, does that work? Like as in labor in the Marxist sense? Or is it that love itself isn't work, but rather that it does work for capitalism? I'm trying to kind of work out if there's a difference between these two things.
Yeah, I think love, sort of in itself, like this, this feeling that we often like come to aspire to, partly through romantic comedies, maybe, that in itself, isn't necessarily work in the sense that I would use it. But I think the way that love is expressed and sort of that romantic relationships are sustained are often through acts, gestures. It's a sort of doing as well as a feeling. And I think when that becomes work is when you're sort of in a social context where actually the needs of other people around you, like your partner, for example, couldn't, easily be met otherwise. So you sort of have this, it's almost like an imperative or an incentive to like, you have to go on like carrying out these sort of acts or gestures of love. Otherwise, you or other people around you couldn't really have a sort of good quality of life. So I think there's something here around not just love in the sort of abstract sense, but I wanted to think of it as a form of doing and a form of acting, which in certain circumstances can be, I think, a type of work.
I have a really weird question, and it's kind of like a 180. But Alva, I'm wondering if we should ask for a moment about the mobilization of actually like hate as an emotion. And kind of like hate used to paint a portrait of like a blocked better future, and in a way kind of meeting emotional needs. I feel that's a huge problem at the moment, and itself serves to reproduce particular visions and notions of how society is and how society could be. Like, for example, maybe with the manosphere, in ways that are tied with capitalism and are generating kind of a lot of economic gain, I guess. Would you want to reflect on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's definitely true that emotional reproduction isn't always about creating good feelings. Sometimes society, as we know it, is sort of sustained by what we might think of as negative feelings, anger, hate, that kind of thing. And often they are coded in sort of more masculine rather than the soft and warm feelings of love that we see as like being feminized. Yeah, so it's interesting that you mentioned the manosphere here. We can also talk about like the role of hate and feelings of anger within the sort of fascist movement more broadly, which I think unfortunately is having an increasing impact on how societies are reproduced today, right? So I guess what I wanted to do in the book is to start taking these things seriously as like really important political forces as well. Ideological sort of ideas can only be sustained if there's some kind of emotional investment in them as well.
So I'm really curious. I feel like every other week I see some article about the male loneliness epidemic or something like this. And in a way, the easy response to that is like, oh, love could mitigate that. Everyone just needs to be loved and cared for. But I'm curious what your response to something like that would be, because it feels like, particularly if we're thinking about the gendered nature of all of this, it's almost like potentially pushing the responsibility for dealing with the male loneliness epidemic back on women, maybe. That I'm not really sure. I'm curious how you would respond to this idea of the male loneliness epidemic from this perspective of emotional reproduction.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting because it's sort of assuming that the either you have like more traditional like coupledom or like nuclear families, or you have individuals who are completely isolated, which I think is maybe a sign of our slightly limited like social imagination, right? That we can't really think of anything outside of those two options. And as you say, the solution seems to always be that, people should return to a sort of more traditional types of relationships and start dating more, or have families, or, have more traditional marriages, for example. And it's never thinking about, like, actually the capitalism is isolating us as individuals, and some people manage to have like personal relationships that might mitigate or make up for some of that, but lots of people are also excluded from those like more normative or traditional forms of intimacy. So I think it's often articulated as a like male loneliness epidemic, as you said, but actually it's something that I think is much more widely felt.
So I guess like the question is, what do we actually do about this, right? I've noticed in recent years a rise in what you might call kind of therapy speak around boundaries, like people calling time on friendships that ask too much of them, or, cutting people out. And we actually touched on this very briefly in our show on burnout, the increasing sense that people are meant to guard against being needed too much, or, being taken advantage of, or being asked to care, right? Like limiting our responsibility towards others, or limiting our care towards others. And I'm curious about how we can think critically about love and emotional reproduction in the way that you're doing, while still valuing care and altruism, and I guess maintaining, it's nice to be nice. I don't know. I reflect on my own life, and some of the most significant and important people to me are friends who I have very caring relationships with and who care for me, and that is so meaningful, and my life would feel so kind of devoid without it. And so how can I be kind of critical about the fact that I'm, in caring for people who might be going through a hard time, I'm helping out capitalism, but I'm also creating like a meaningful relationship here as well. Have we got ourselves in knots about all of this is really is really the question I'm asking.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this, I guess, discourse over the last few years around like emotional labor in this sense of, you should be cutting people off if they're sort of not pulling their weight or whatever. To me, it sounds like it's very individualistic way of thinking about it. And it's reinforcing this idea, which I critique in the book, which is that we are these sovereign, like self-sustaining individuals who don't really need other people for care, and that you could just be that person if you removed yourself from any relationship where you might be performing any kind of care. And I think what me and other people who are sort of in a similar tradition to me are saying is not that we should, care less for other people. We should care more, but the forms that we're sort of caring under, the social relationships that within we are being made to care, they are the problem, right? And it's the problem that some people are being called to perform so much care that they can't really care for themselves. And it's sort of that has just been taken for granted. And those people that we talked about before who don't have access to those like more normative forms of relationships might not have access to care at all. So I guess in terms of what we do about this, like thinking about friendship is really important for me, because it's sort of a model for what care could look like that is, at least in some cases, removed from this sort of hierarchy of like there's a particular person who's always doing the caring, and then the other person is sort of receiving most of the care. And I think we could have structures of care that are sort of much more flexible in a way, and might actually be able to meet more people's needs than the sort of traditional nuclear family structure, which is often about meeting particular people's needs. So it's more about, like, I guess, restructuring in a way how we sort of care for each other, and that absolutely involves going beyond romantic coupledom or nuclear families and the sort of the places where we assume that we'll get the care that we need.
And kind of like bouncing back on these ideas that you mentioned, though, you could say that online, at least, there's been some good noise about like the domestic realm. For example, I'm thinking about memes about the mental load, which I've seen highlighting the cognitive labor typically taken on by mothers, right? Where next for these kinds of discussions? Do we need to just rebalance the domestic divisions of labor, like talk more about equality? Is that the kind of solution?
Those conversations maybe don't really go far enough. I think they're definitely like onto something really important. And this idea of the mental load is a way of naming these sort of unseen, invisible types of like effort that people put into their intimate relationships, right? Relationships with family members and so on. And that's really important, I think. But I guess in terms of where we go after we've sort of arrived at that critique is the big question. And I think some of the debate here sort of stops at, we just need more equality and some like reform in terms of who does what within the household. And there's this long tradition of sort of encouraging men and dads to sort of help out more at home, which in a way is still assuming that the woman partner is the person who's like responsible and then the man is sort of helping. And I think as important is to sort of critique the division of labour within nuclear families. They're still sort of assuming that you will have a couple of people who are doing all of the work of raising children, for example, whereas we could think much more critically about that structure and think more about like actually maybe two people isn't enough, and actually the nuclear family has never really been able to sustain itself on its own. It's always relied on other people, whether that's like relatives or nannies. So I'm thinking more in terms of like, what can we do in order to make sure that the people who need care get what they need? And that might involve like multiple people. It might involve relationships who are not seen as sort of blood relatives or family members. It's also important to think about what do the people who are providing care need? How do we make sure that everyone who's involved in those relationships are sort of getting what they need? So I think this discourse that you referenced, is sort of not going far enough. Equality as a concept can be useful sometimes, but sometimes it's still sort of assuming that it means equality between two partners, basically. And it's about rebalancing that relationship rather than thinking what more the people need outside of that.
I feel like what you were just saying about, spreading the, let's call it the caring load or whatever you might want to call it, more equitably or across a wider web of relationships than just kind of the immediate nuclear family. I mean, this is kind of like queering emotional reproduction, right? It reminds me a lot of what I see in my own kind of queer circles where, friendship networks are more significant. Like people don't have nuclear families a lot of the time or are not as close to their nuclear families as they might be to friends. You have this idea of the logical family or queer family or whatever, which are usually like friends and ex-lovers and, this wide web of like interesting relationships where care is happening. And I'm just reflecting on this and like what it does, because like it does kind of, in a way, spread care across, like break you free of this particular sort of social norm around how relationships and care is structured. But one of the things I'm curious about is, I think that challenges kind of, let's say, like a hegemonic kind of heterosexual patriarchal way of structuring kind of units in society. But when I look at my own friendship network, I'm not sure how much it's necessarily kind of undermining capitalism, let's say. Like we all still have to have jobs to pay the rent. And like when my friend gets sick, I make him soup and go over and walk his dog for him or, like check in on him and see if he's okay. I'm performing all this care as a friend, but that's still kind of in a way serving him to help him get better and help him be able to return to his job so that he can pay his rent. And I'm just kind of curious about, I guess, thinking about queering emotional reproduction, but also what the limits of it might be.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think we need to be quite careful here and not say that, oh, if everyone, had like close, caring relationships with their friends, that would be a threat to capitalism. I don't think it necessarily would be. So for me, it's interesting to think of these examples of people having good and fulfilling lives outside of the nuclear family as a sort of way of thinking about how we could shift like structures of care, but that in itself is not enough, right? So in order to think of like what it would look like to sort of actually start to undo some of those capitalist forms of reproduction, I think we also need to think of this as part of a bigger sort of anti-capitalist project. It's really important for me to think about how, for example, social movements can involve a commitment to other forms of care that sort of go beyond just an assumption that people will be able to sort out their needs on their own in this sort of privatized, very individualized way. And so thinking about how we start to build a world where people's needs are met in a more collective way. And that needs to happen through not just people's sort of reorganizing their own private lives, but also like the sort of bigger, more traditionally like political questions around housing and around access to healthcare, elder care, childcare.
Thanks, Alva. Just a word now from our producer, Alice, and we'll be right back with you.
Hi, thanks for listening to Uncommon Sense. First up, a request. The Sociological Review Foundation is a charity, and we believe that sociology is for everybody, and that advancing public understanding of it, getting sociology out there into the world, is really important. We'd be really grateful if you'd consider contributing to help the foundation keep bringing this show to you. Head to donorbox.org/uncommon-sense. That link is also in our show notes, where you can directly support the making of Uncommon Sense. Any feedback or ideas or questions, we're at uncommonsense@thesociologicalreview.org, and it'd be great to hear from you. And if you're enjoying hearing Alva Gotby talking to Rosie and Alexis about love and reproduction, head over to the podcast page on the Sociological Review website or scroll through in the archive on the app you're using to hear this. You'll find shows on care, emotion, listening, burnout, rules, and so much more. Thanks for listening.
Okay, so Alva, we're at that part where we like to hear about a thinker who's inspired you to have a bit of a uncommon sense. And today we're talking about a movement, the Wages for Housework movement. So let's get right into it.
Yeah, Wages for Housework was an international network of feminist organizations that was started in the early 70s. Some of those groups are still active today, actually, so that's important to mention as well. But sort of at its peak, it was a network of organizations that existed in several European countries, as well as North America, Latin America. And the idea that they sort of wanted to put out there is that women's work and caring work is actually a really important part of how capitalism functions. As you can probably guess, this is an idea that has inspired me a lot. And I think also this other feminist thinkers who are working today, for example, Sophie Lewis or Sophie K. Rosa, who's sort of writing in a similar tradition. And this idea that the work that women were doing at that time, often as housewives, was like really important to the whole economy, wasn't really something that had been explored before the 70s. And so it was quite a sort of new and quite controversial idea that caring work could actually matter and be important and be politically relevant as well. And they met quite a lot of resistance to this idea, both from sort of male comrades on the left who thought, oh, this is ridiculous, this is sort of challenging how we would normally do politics and talk about politics, but also from some parts of the feminist movement who maybe thought that this was a little bit too radical in a way. and challenging not just your sort of individual relationship to your partner or to housework as such, but also to capitalism as a whole.
I wonder if you could tell us about how it is often misunderstood, because it seems like the name Wages for Housework gives the impression that it's saying women should be paid for doing their housework, but that wasn't quite the point they were making, I think. Could you explain that to us?
Yeah, so they chose this sort of slogan, Wages for Housework, as a name, although they were already from the start, I think people were feeling quite ambivalent about it. And yeah, so they were sort of saying women should be paid for the unpaid work they're doing in their homes and their communities, but they never meant that as a sort of, in a very like literal sense of that just being a sort of reform that could happen and then, things would be fine. Silvia Federici, as you mentioned before, she has this essay called Wages Against Housework, where she's sort of saying that this is an impossible demand because women couldn't be paid for all of the currently unpaid work they're doing. So it's sort of challenging. It's sort of suggesting that the work that women are doing in an unpaid capacity, the sort of sum total of that is so big that if it was actually paid, it would completely break capitalist economies.
So, I mean, Wages for Housework took inspiration, I think, from the National Welfare Rights Organization in the US. I know that you mentioned this in your book, and you also highlight Sarah Ferris's work on the devaluation in Europe today of the labour of immigrant women. And I'm wondering if you can reflect on that, a bit generally, like the need to remember that the material and even emotional well-being of so many people relies on exploitation, racialized hierarchies, all of this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's important to remember when we talk about like nuclear families, as I said before, they have often depended on someone else doing some of the mothering labor, if you want to think of it that way. Often nannies and childcare workers have sort of been involved in sustaining that, as well as other people working within the sort of bourgeois home and, making sure that that household can keep running. And that is something that you can see like running through capitalist sort of histories of the household, really, and social reproduction more broadly, is that it's often working class women, often migrant women, who are doing some of the like hardest and lowest paid forms of work. And, this is really visible today. Lots of the people who sort of perform really devalued caring work, especially elder care, are often migrant women who are very badly paid and have sort of terrible working conditions, and are often seen as, just completely disposable as well.
This really allows us also to kind of make visible a diversity of experiences that are happening all around. And like the Wages for Housework movement obviously is still relevant. And going a bit more sideways here, I'm also wondering how you would relate it maybe to something like the trad wife phenomenon, and actually even to the rise of maybe pronatalism in countries like the US. Is there a feeling that things are kind of going backwards or something?
Yeah, I mean, that type of ideas is really interesting. And I think it's interesting to look at it in the sort of longer view of feminist history, right? And from the late 60s onwards, liberal feminism had this big emphasis on women going to work and having a career. And then that became the sort of pop cultural idea of the woman who can have it all, and you can have a career and children. And actually, the way that capitalist economies are structured, the way that wage work is sort of assumes a particular kind of worker who doesn't really have caring responsibilities, that means that I think a lot of women has, come to experience that as like really difficult and unsatisfying, and that you've sort of been sold a lie in a way that you could have a really an amazing career and then, have a really satisfying home life and, spend loads of time with your children. And like, that is actually really difficult to balance. So I think you can use a sort of Marxist feminist critique here and say, actually, the way that capitalist economies and wage work were structured never really allowed for that easily for someone to have sort of unpaid like caring responsibilities and then also having a really satisfying career on top of that is sort of impossible. And now we've ended up with some women feeling this sort of nostalgic like longing for what's seen as an easier time or a different time when you didn't have to do all of it and you could choose to do just one thing. And like maybe there's also like a critique here of like wage work and how draining and difficult lots of people actually find their careers. So there's definitely something here, but then obviously trad wives are very much romanticizing what they see as this traditional family as an alternative to wage work, when actually you can think of them as sort of two sides of the same coin, really. I don't think that, returning to unpaid work in the home is really a remedy to, the stressful capitalist economy.
Alva, it's been great to have you here today. We sometimes kind of do a little pop culture tip or something at the end of the show. And, I recently went down a really weird internet rabbit hole about young women in China who apparently pay men, and very muscular men apparently, that seems to be an important point to make, for a hug, for stress relief. So apparently there also was the free hugs movement, which I personally did not encounter, but I am aware that it was a thing. And this is like capitalism has like yoink taken that and kind of packaged it up, and it's you can now pay for your stress relief. I'm not sure if if there's anything else you want to add for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an example, right, of the fact that maybe the nuclear family isn't like the structure that is necessarily meeting people's needs all of the time, where it's become sort of undermined and less stable in some ways. And then nothing really has replaced it other than these quite weird forms of like commodified emotional labor, whatever. It's quite absurd and sad that we're at a point where people have to, pay for hugs rather than, having nourishing support networks around us that can actually meet our needs in a different way. So and I think we see lots of different examples of that sort of popping up, people talking about emotional labor in this like really commodified way as well. And what you mentioned before in terms of lots of people feeling really lonely, as well as a sort of symptom of the fact that, people don't really get what they need, and there's nothing really to provide that. But I think in a way that's also an opportunity for us who are sort of able to present a different version of what different kind of social life could look like, that's more collective, that's sort of more evenly distributed in terms of who's doing that work, and that's actually more able to meet people's needs in a sort of genuine way rather than just offering you a hug that you paid for.
Alexis, did you ever encounter the free hugs thing? Was that a thing in Canada?
So actually, I encountered the free hugs things like in kind of more like cosplay and furries event. Okay, so that's a whole thing.
Well, Alva, we're going to put everything we touched on today in our show notes, including that kind of, paying for hugs thing. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on the show.
That's it for this month's Uncommon Sense. More from us next time. But until then, do check out our archives with related shows on Care with Bev Skeggs, Emotion with Billy Halsberg, and Burnout with Hannah Proctor. All great stuff for teaching around these themes actually too.
Yes, and if you can, do donate to support the making of this show. Whether the amount of a coffee or something bigger, it's all gratefully received. just head to donorbox.org/uncommon-sense. You'll find the link in our show notes.
Our producer is Alice Block, and our sound engineer is Dave Crackles.
Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.